In this video we'll be putting the rear wheel back into the Matchless G3L. If you want to know how to remove it, then please refer to the earlier video. Well, I'm using a hydraulic lift here with a handy slot to put the rear wheel through. If you don't have this equipment, then you could do it with 2 or 3 people raising the rear of the bike. If you deflate the tire slightly to make it smaller, you can then squeeze it up into the space and then lower the rear stand and lower the bike back onto the ground. It's a difficult way of doing it, but it can be done that way. The most useful tools that I've got in my garage are this piece of wood and 2 bricks, which you'll see more of later. Now here I'm greasing the axle just to make it a little bit easier to get out the next time we remove the wheel, and I'm going to insert it through the frame and through the wheel, although you'll notice that at the moment none of the fixings are in place, nor none of the bushes nor the spacers. They'll come later. Now the first time you put a rear wheel back on one of these bikes, you'll end up cursing and swearing, or I did anyway, and you'll wonder if there's ever enough room to get it in. But if you find yourself using brute force at any stage or getting annoyed with it, then just stop, have a cup of tea and have a word with yourself, because if you're really careful you can create space for everything and get the wheel in easily. So first of all, you see I place the little spacer or bush that comes from inside the drum brake over the hole and then gently push the axle in from the right, just enough so that it holds that spacer in position. Now you can put the drum brake into position. At this stage the drum brake doesn't have to be lined up precisely, but you do need the little plate where the bolt goes through to secure it to the frame in roughly the right place. Once the brake is loosely positioned, move to the right hand side and put the axle through a little bit further so it emerges from the hole in the centre of the brake. This is where you're going to put the next spacer. Once this spacer is on the axle, then the idea is to manoeuvre the wheel so that the spacer slots neatly into the subframe on the left. Once this is done, it'll take a little bit of weight off the wheel. Now we push the axle through from the other side of the bike as far as it will go. Often this is limited by the pannier frame. Now, to save yourself a great deal of aggravation, just get a couple of bricks, put one in front and one behind the rear wheel. And now whenever you reposition the wheel, just move the bricks to hold everything where you carefully positioned it, and that will really help to line things up later. And now the idea is we push the axle in from left to right just enough to get the next piece of equipment on, and that's the speedo. Now remember, this speedo has a small spacer inside it and you must make sure that that's fitted. Now push the axle through a little more from left to right and fit the spacer that goes between the speedo and the frame on the right. If you haven't got enough room at this stage, just gently twist the wheel from left to right to create the space that you need. Now, with everything lined up with the help of our trusty bricks, tap the axle through from the left to the right so the thread comes all the way through and emerges on the right hand side of the frame. Now go to the left hand side of the bike again and just put on the washer and the axle nut and do them up finger tight. Do the same on the right hand side and then carefully fit the speedo cable. Now the speedo unit will be quite loose at this stage, so just pull it up until the barrel at the top is more or less 12 o'clock. Do it up finger tight, and then we'll nip it up with a spanner. Now replace the workbench tray. You can line up the holes to secure the drum brake using a screwdriver, and then insert the bolt from inside to outside, and the square end of the bolt locates into a slot of the same shape. Now do up the nut and replace the split pin. Here's one I broke earlier. You may have noticed that the clutch is exposed because I removed the chain case to do another job earlier. This has no bearing at all on the rear wheel insertion. The next job is to fit the drivetrain, but if there's any tension on this at all, it'll be really difficult to do. So do yourself a favour at this stage and undo the lock nuts on the wheel adjusters so you can move the wheel forward in the axle, and that'll make fitting the chain a lot easier. I find it easiest to put the chain over the rear sprocket with the two ends that need to be joined on adjoining teeth. Then you can put the split link through and put the clip on. Now it's really important when you put the clip on to remember that the closed end, the curved end, is facing the direction of rotation. Now we'll retighten the chain tensioning bolts on each side, and provided you didn't move the lock nuts very much, they should go back to their original positions and you shouldn't have to realign the rear wheel. When correctly adjusted, you should be able to move the chain at the midpoint between the sprockets between 3/8 and half an inch. That's chain width of 3/8 to half an inch. Now tighten up the axle nuts on each side and have a look at the wheel from the back to see if it's running roughly true. Now refit the brake lever arm, remembering to use a split pin to secure the pin at the top, and test it to make sure it slows the rear wheel effectively. Now we position the rear stand, and the way to get this right is to make sure that the little lug that holds the spring is on the right and the horns are pointing downwards. The stand locates to the outside of the frame. When you replace the stand bolts, make sure that the washer goes underneath the bolt head. It shouldn't go through to the other side of the frame and underneath the nut, because this will hinder the correct operation of the rear stand. there isn't much room on the left hand side between the frame of the bike and the drum of the brake, and so when you're trying to put the rear stand left nut on, it can be really difficult and it slips out of position easily. So you might find it helpful to tape the nut to a spanner. Now tighten it up on the left. Then refit the spring on the right. For this purpose I made a simple tool with a piece of wire and 2 nuts and bolts to wrap my fingers around. If you look carefully you'll see that I've put the spring on back to front because I pretty much lost my mind at this point in the evening. But it didn't seem to make any practical difference and I reversed it later. And finally tighten the rear stand on the right hand side. And now we can lower the bike, unclamp the front wheel, remove the paddock stand and put the bike onto its own rear stand. And we're done. So I hope that's been helpful. If not, then please do let me know. And if you know of a better technique or anything that's easier, then please let me know and I'll change the video. At the end, I'll put a summary of all the steps involved.